The first breath of winter always felt different at Eleanor Vance's cottage, a sharpness in the air that seemed to deepen the solitude. At 72, Eleanor lived a life meticulously woven into the fabric of the sprawling national park that bordered her property, her days now dictated by the solitary rhythm of brushstrokes on canvas. She was a painter of quiet landscapes, of the fleeting light that kissed the snow-dusted peaks and the muted greens of ancient pines. It was a fragile piece she had cultivated over the past 5 years, a desperate attempt to fill the gaping void left by the sudden, brutal quiet of her husband, Thomas, slipping away in his sleep. Thomas had been the vibrant counterpoint to her contemplative nature. A retired forester with a laugh that echoed through the valley, he had brought the outside world into her studio, filling it with tales of deer sightings, the call of distant owls, and the scent of damp earth. Their life together, though simple, had been a canvas of shared joys and quiet companionship. He had built the cottage with his own hands, felled the trees, laid the stones, and even installed the massive, north-facing window that bathed her studio in perfect, even light. Every plank, every nail held a memory. When he died, it wasn't just his physical presence that vanished, it was the vibrant color from her world, leaving behind a stark, grayscale emptiness that even her most luminous paints couldn't replicate. In the wake of her loss, Eleanor had retreated deeper into herself, and deeper into the woods. She found solace in the methodical act of painting, each stroke a silent meditation, but the joy, the spark, had dimmed. Her landscapes, once vibrant with an almost spiritual light, now often held a melancholy hue, a reflection of the artist's soul. Her only constant companion was Marmalade, a ginger cat of discerning taste and profound independence, who currently surveyed the frost-kissed window from his perch on a sunbeam, an undisputed monarch of the cozy, art-filled domain. Marmalade was a creature of habit and routine, and his steady presence was a small, anchoring comfort in Eleanor's often adrift days. He demanded breakfast at precisely 7 a.m., insisted on midday naps in specific sunbeams, and tolerated, rather than enjoyed, Eleanor's quiet ministrations. Their unspoken pact was one of mutual existence, a silent understanding of shared space. One brutal December morning, however, the usual tranquility was shattered. A desperate, whimpering cry, thin and fragile, was carried on the frigid wind, cutting through the silence of the snow-laden pines. It was a sound of profound distress, not the confident, wild call of an adult bear. Eleanor, bundled in a thick wool cardigan that smelled faintly of old paint and lavender, felt an inexplicable urgency, a primitive pull. Her arthritic knees protested with every step as she navigated the icy path towards the sound, her breath pluming white in the sub-zero air. She found him tucked beneath a massive, snow-laden pine at the very edge of her property, where her cultivated yard blurred into the untamed wilderness of the national park. He was tiny, barely more than a bundle of dark fur, shivering violently, so small he could fit into the crook of her arm. His left hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, crimson seeping into the pristine white snow beneath him. A thin wire, likely from an old, illegal snare, was still partially wrapped around his delicate limb, biting into the flesh. No sign of a den. No mother. The raw vulnerability of the creature struck a chord deep within Eleanor, a woman who rarely deviated from her routine, who had deliberately sealed herself off from deep emotional attachments. But looking into those terrified, yet surprisingly resilient, dark eyes, she felt something stir within her that had long been dormant. Against all logic, against the wilderness wisdom she'd always respected about non-interference, she knew she couldn't leave him. With trembling hands, she carefully, gently, scooped up the shivering bundle. His small body was surprisingly light, feather-light, a testament to his starvation and distress. Back in the warmth of her cottage, the air thick with the comforting scent of pine and wood smoke, Marmalade regarded the new arrival with a mix of disdain and detached curiosity, his tail twitching slowly, a silent pendulum measuring the disruption. The bear cub, still trembling, let out a weak whimper. Eleanor laid him gently on an old woolen blanket by the crackling fireplace. She remembered fleeting lessons from nature documentaries and old veterinary books her grandfather, a rural doctor, had kept. Using sterilized scissors, she painstakingly cut away the wire, wincing at the raw wound beneath. She cleaned the injury with warm, antiseptic water, then fashioned a makeshift splint from a discarded paint-stirring stick and some gauze, her artist's hands surprisingly steady despite her inner turmoil. He was starving. Eleanor, who usually only kept tea and simple pantry staples, rummaged through her fridge. She found a carton of goat's milk, which she occasionally used for baking her husband's favorite bread. She warmed it gently, then fed the hungry creature with a dropper, one careful drop at a time, watching as his small throat convulsed with desperate gulps. The cub, weak but surprisingly resilient, sucked greedily, then looked up at her with eyes like polished obsidian, unfathomably ancient yet utterly innocent, brimming with a primitive trust. "You're a wild thing, aren't you?" she whispered, stroking his damp fur, feeling the rapid thump of his tiny heart against her palm. She needed a name, a strong name for such a fragile, yet fierce, spirit. She looked out her studio window, where the constellation of Ursa Major, the Great Bear, now shone brightly, a silent beacon in the vast winter sky. "Orion," she murmured, and the cub let out a soft sigh, as if in agreement. Orion's recovery was a grueling, sleepless odyssey. The first few nights, Eleanor barely left his side, checking his fever, making sure he was breathing, changing his improvised splint, and feeding him every few hours. She consulted old veterinary books her grandfather had kept, frantically cross-referencing symptoms and dosages for animal milk replacers. The constant anxiety was a heavy cloak, but underneath it, a strange, forgotten feeling began to stir: purpose. The cottage, once a quiet mausoleum of her grief, now buzzed with the soft hum of life. As he slowly regained strength, Orion's movements became more confident, his whimpers replaced by playful nips at her fingers and attempts to scramble on wobbly legs. Marmalade, initially deeply offended by the interloper, maintained a careful distance. He would hiss softly if Orion came too close to his food bowl, his ginger tail twitching a clear boundary. Yet, Eleanor noticed the subtle shifts. Marmalade occasionally observed Orion's antics from a slightly closer vantage point, his ears swiveling with something akin to curiosity. Eventually, the cat conceded to sharing a sunbeam, though always maintaining a respectable distance from the furry invader. Their unspoken truce was a source of quiet amusement for Eleanor. Orion's presence began to chip away at the rigid layers of grief around Eleanor's heart. Her usually quiet cottage filled with soft whimpers, the gentle lapping of milk, and the tentative, then confident, patter of small paws. She found herself smiling more, even chuckling aloud at Orion's clumsy attempts to play with Marmalade, who would respond with a disdainful flick of his tail. Her brushstrokes on the canvas, once laden with a subtle sorrow, now gained a vibrancy and freedom they had lacked for years. She painted Orion sleeping by the fire, a study in contentment, Orion gazing out the window with a curious tilt of his head, eyes alive with burgeoning awareness. Even Marmalade begrudgingly sharing a blanket with the growing cub, their unlikely coexistence becoming a profound new muse for her work. The colors on her palette became brighter, more hopeful, reflecting the subtle but powerful shift within her own spirit. As Orion healed, his unique personality truly emerged. He wasn't like a dog, despite his playful nature. He moved with an inherent lumbering grace, a fluid strength beneath his growing fur that spoke of his wild lineage. His senses were preternaturally keen, his large, rounded ears constantly swiveling to catch the faintest rustle of leaves or distant bird call from the woods. He would often stare intently out the window towards the forest, a deep, ancestral longing in his eyes. Yet, he also developed the most peculiar habits that deeply endeared him to Eleanor and proved his singular upbringing. She discovered his fascination with classical music one afternoon when a Mozart concerto played from her antique radio, its rich notes filling the small living room. Orion, who had been restlessly pacing, suddenly settled, his head cocked, his eyes fixed on the speaker with an almost human intensity. From then on, classical music became a regular feature in the cottage, a soothing balm for Eleanor and a strange fascination for Orion. He would often listen with an almost meditative stillness, sometimes letting out a soft sigh of contentment or even a soft, low huff if a piece particularly moved him. He seemed to have a preference for string instruments and melodic pieces, turning his head away if Eleanor put on something too jarring or dissonant. Even stranger was his interest in her art. He would sit for hours in her studio, a silent, furry observer as she worked. He seemed mesmerized by the changing colors, the evolving landscapes taking shape under her hand. Sometimes, he'd gently nudge her hand with his wet nose, as if offering an opinion on a shade of blue, or try to help by nudging a loose brush across the floor, his tail giving a slow, almost imperceptible wag, sending Eleanor into fits of delighted laughter. The scent of turpentine and oil paints, once a lonely reminder of her passion, now became as comforting to Orion as the smell of his own food, a unique signature of their shared world. He quickly learned the boundaries of the house, surprisingly gentle with delicate canvases and jars of paint, as if understanding their preciousness. He never chewed on anything he shouldn't, never knocked over an easel, moving through her creative space with an uncanny respect. Life settled into an unusual rhythm. Eleanor painted, Orion watched and listened to music, and Marmalade presided over all with his customary regal aloofness. Orion's leg, though healed, still had a slight limp, a subtle reminder of his difficult beginnings and an argument against his full re-release into the wild. As spring unfurled its green tapestry outside, Orion grew rapidly, his puppy clumsiness giving way to the powerful, compact form of a young bear. Eleanor expanded his indoor space, dedicating an entire sunroom off the kitchen as his den, complete with soft bedding and toys. She took him on short, supervised walks on a long lead in the least frequented parts of her property, ensuring he stayed close and unseen. She understood the delicate balance. He needed space to stretch his wilder instincts, but she also needed to keep him hidden. However, the deep woods were rarely truly empty. Unbeknownst to Eleanor, a new, ambitious park ranger, David Albright, had recently been assigned to this sector of the national park. Albright was a stickler for regulations, a by-the-book professional dedicated to wildlife conservation and public safety. He was known for his sharp eye and his unwavering commitment to maintaining the wilderness's integrity. He had begun to notice subtle discrepancies in the local wildlife reports. Unusually few berry patches disturbed near Eleanor's property, faint, unidentifiable large paw prints on little-used trails. Whispers from the town, vague at first, then more specific, about the eccentric painter with her unusual pet, eventually reached his ears. These were whispers he couldn't ignore. One crisp spring morning, his official park vehicle, a dark green SUV, pulled up Eleanor's gravel driveway. Its presence was a jarring intrusion against the serene backdrop of the forest. Its methodical crunch on the gravel, the slam of the door, were loud signals in Eleanor's quiet world. Her heart immediately sank. His sharp, official knock echoed through Eleanor's quiet home, sending Orion retreating to the safety of the sunroom, a low, wary huff rumbling in his chest. Marmalade, sensing the tension, disappeared under a sofa. Eleanor opened the door, a polite but firm expression on her face. "Mrs. Vance, I'm Ranger David Albright," he stated, his voice firm, his eyes scanning the yard for any sign of the animal. "I understand you've taken in a bear cub." Eleanor, always a private person, felt a tremor of fear, a familiar tightening in her chest. She explained Orion's injury, his abandonment, her desperate attempts to find help through various channels, wildlife hotlines, local animal rescues, even distant sanctuaries, that had all turned her away, citing lack of space or resources, or the prohibitive liability of a wild bear. She explained how she couldn't just leave him to die. "He was dying, Ranger," she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "I nursed him back to health. He knows no other home." She even opened the door to the sunroom, revealing a now healthy, nearly yearling Orion, who, seeing a stranger, warily kept his distance behind Eleanor's legs, his ears flattened slightly, a low rumble of caution still in his throat. Albright listened, taking meticulous notes on a small pad, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Ma'am, I appreciate your compassion, but keeping a bear, especially one habituated to humans, is illegal and dangerous. He needs to be in a professional sanctuary. This isn't just a pet, it's a wild animal, and a powerful one at that. His instincts will emerge, and you simply cannot provide what he needs, nor can you guarantee public safety." He concluded, his voice unwavering, "I'll need to arrange for his transfer within the week. Failure to comply will result in severe legal penalties." Eleanor's heart sank. The thought of Orion in a sterile, caged environment, separated from the only home he'd ever known, was unbearable. "He won't survive in a standard sanctuary, Ranger," she pleaded, her voice cracking slightly. "He trusts me. He knows Marmalade. He loves Mozart. He's not like other bears. His leg, too, never fully healed, he limps sometimes. He couldn't forage or defend himself effectively, not with that old injury." Albright merely raised an eyebrow, a dismissive gesture that stung Eleanor more than any harsh words. He left her with a formal notice, a stark, white document that felt like a death sentence for her peace and for Orion's. But Snowpine Creek's art community was a surprisingly tight-knit and fiercely loyal bunch, a vibrant network of painters, sculptors, potters, and musicians. They revered Eleanor, not just for her talent, her landscapes were renowned for their almost spiritual light, but for her quiet strength, her deep connection to the natural world, and the unyielding integrity of her spirit. Word of Ranger Albright's visit and the official notice spread like wildfire among them, whispered from coffee shop to pottery studio. Martha, the sharp-witted, no-nonsense owner of the local gallery where Eleanor displayed her paintings, and a longtime friend of Eleanor's, immediately sprang into action. She had seen the new light in Eleanor's eyes, the renewed energy and emotional depth in her recent landscapes. She recognized the profound healing Orion had brought. "We can't let them take Orion," she declared to a gathering of artists over lukewarm coffee and stale pastries at her gallery. Eleanor's found her spark again because of that cub. And that cub, well, he's basically a very large, furry, classical music aficionado. A few chuckles broke the tension, but everyone agreed something had to be done. And so, a quiet but determined rebellion began. It wasn't loud protests or defiant rallies, it was a methodical, artistic, and community-driven campaign. Artists dedicated their next pieces to Eleanor and Orion, subtle tributes that spoke of unusual bonds and the beauty of unexpected companionship. Musicians composed short, evocative pieces inspired by the bear who loved Mozart. Local naturalists, many of whom had admired Eleanor's ecological ethos for years, penned eloquent letters to the Department of Natural Resources. They highlighted Eleanor's long-standing connection to the wilderness, her decades of living harmoniously with nature, and argued for a nuanced approach to Orion's unique circumstances. They emphasized his early injury, his physical limitations that would make it impossible for him to thrive independently in the wild, and most importantly, his deep, unusual bond with Eleanor, citing behavioral evidence. The town's elderly librarian, a formidable woman named Agnes who remembered Eleanor as a quiet, studious child, collected newspaper clippings documenting past cases of wildlife rehabilitation, searching for precedents. She even dug up old articles about Thomas Vance's work as a forester, subtly emphasizing Eleanor's deep roots in the park. Children from the local school, inspired by their parents' stories, drew crayon pictures of Eleanor and a friendly bear playing in the woods, along with their ginger cat, sometimes with musical notes floating in the air. These were sent en masse to the department, their childish innocence a stark contrast to the formal legalities. Eleanor, though shy and overwhelmed by the sudden attention, felt a surge of warmth and renewed hope from this unexpected show of solidarity. The fear that had gripped her began to recede, replaced by a quiet determination. Ranger Albright, however, was not easily swayed. His office was filling with letters and drawings, his voicemail with impassioned messages, but his training emphasized wildlife safety and the inherent unpredictability of wild animals, especially predators. He scheduled another visit, intending to finalize the transfer details. He arrived prepared to counter sentiment with protocol, but what he found was more complex than his reports suggested. He found Eleanor in her studio, the afternoon light illuminating a half-finished canvas on the easel. It was a portrait of Orion, not the abstract landscape he expected, capturing the subtle intelligence in the cub's eyes. Orion lay by the massive window, his head cocked, listening to a Chopin nocturne playing softly from Eleanor's antique radio, his ears twitching occasionally as if following the melody. Martha and several other townspeople stood nearby, a quiet, resolute presence, their gazes fixed on Albright, a silent challenge. Marmalade sat on a bookshelf, observing the scene with his typical sphinx-like composure. Albright sighed. He had spent weeks reviewing the case, sifting through the deluge of letters, cross-referencing behavioral reports. He had even watched snippets of Eleanor's discreetly placed security camera footage, installed by Martha's tech-savvy nephew, which showed Orion's surprisingly gentle interactions with Eleanor and Marmalade. He knew this wasn't a simple case of a reckless individual. He observed Orion now, calm and seemingly at peace, not the dangerous, agitated animal he'd been trained to expect in such close quarters with a human. He noticed the slight, almost imperceptible limp in Orion's hind leg, the result of the old snare. He noted the way Orion's gaze, though wild, was always soft when it landed on Eleanor. He walked closer to the window, watching Orion. "He really listens to music?" Albright asked, a hint of genuine curiosity in his voice, surprising even himself. Eleanor smiled softly. He has his favorites. Chopin seems to soothe him. Mozart invigorates him. Bach, well, he tolerates Bach. She saw a flicker of something in Albright's eyes, a crack in his rigid professionalism. Ranger Albright, she continued, I know the regulations. I respect them. But Orion is not just a bear. He is a victim of human carelessness, injured and abandoned. He has known only human kindness. He cannot forage or defend himself efficiently, he has lost his natural fear of humans, and he is deeply bonded to me and to Marmalade. To move him to a standard sanctuary would be, in my professional opinion, a second abandonment. It would break him. Martha stepped forward, a relieved smile breaking through her usual stern expression. Ranger, this isn't just about a pet. This is about a life saved, a community united, and an elderly woman finding purpose again after immense loss. Eleanor's painting, her very spirit, has revived with Orion. He is as much a part of this landscape as the trees, now. Albright ran a hand over his face, a gesture of weariness mixed with reluctant admiration. He was a man of logic and procedure, but he also valued responsibility and integrity. He saw a responsible owner, not a negligent one. He saw a bear that, while undeniably wild in spirit, had been uniquely shaped by trauma and an unforeseen bond. He recognized that forcing this bear into a typical sanctuary environment, where he'd be surrounded by other bears he didn't know, and without the human connection he'd imprinted on, could indeed be more detrimental than beneficial. Mrs. Vance, he began, his voice softer, less authoritative than before, the department has reviewed the unique circumstances. Your commitment, the community's overwhelming support, and Orion's unusual behavioral adaptations have led to a rare decision. Eleanor held her breath, her heart pounding with a desperate hope. We are granting a special, conditional permit for Orion to remain in your care. However, strict regulations apply. His outdoor enclosure will need significant upgrades, higher fences, a larger area, and more natural features that meet specific wildlife habitat standards. Regular veterinary checkups by a wildlife specialist will be mandatory, as will annual inspections from my department, unannounced. No public contact, ever. And you'll need to demonstrate continuous efforts to provide an environment that meets his needs as he matures, with documented proof of his welfare and any behavioral changes. This is unprecedented, Mrs. Vance. We're creating a new designation for him, a managed habituated wild animal. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, hot and unexpected. The relief was so profound it made her knees tremble. Thank you, Ranger, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, unable to say more. Orion, sensing the profound shift in her mood, padded over and gently nudged her hand with his nose, then glanced at Albright, his obsidian eyes seeming to understand the weight of the moment. Martha stepped forward, a relieved smile breaking through her usual stern expression, offering Albright a freshly baked scone from her bag, an offering of peace and gratitude. Albright, surprised, took it, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity, a vibrant tapestry woven by the community of Snowpine Creek. It was a project born of collective will and shared affection for Eleanor and her extraordinary charge. Donations poured in, not just money, but time, skills, and materials. Local carpenters, builders, and even the high school shop class, under the guidance of Thomas Vance's old colleagues, contributed their expertise. The existing small fence around Eleanor's property was replaced with a formidable, yet aesthetically pleasing, structure. It was built using natural logs and reinforced wire mesh, designed to be nearly invisible against the forest backdrop, extending deep into Eleanor's property to encompass several acres of forest. It was a true haven of natural logs, a cool stream fed by a spring, and hidden nooks for Orion to explore, blending seamlessly with the surrounding woods. They even built him a dedicated, insulated den dug into a hillside, ensuring he had natural shelter year-round. Orion, now a majestic young bear nearing his full size, with a sleek, powerful build and eyes that shimmered with primal intelligence, spent his days roaming his extended territory. His wild spirit was content within the bounds of his peculiar home. He chased squirrels, played hide-and-seek with Marmalade, who, despite his age, displayed surprising agility, and honed his foraging instincts on the occasional berry bush that ventured into his expansive enclosure. He loved the stream, often lying submerged in its cool waters on warm days, only his head visible. He would practice his grunts and huffs, deep, resonant sounds that echoed through the forest, a call and response that Eleanor would sometimes answer with a soft, melodic note on her flute, a habit she'd picked up after Thomas's passing. But every evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the clearing, he would return to the porch. He would wait patiently for Eleanor, a silent sentinel, his powerful form softened by an undeniable gentleness. And as she settled into her rocking chair, Marmalade purring contentedly on her lap, Orion would lie at her feet, his massive head resting on her old worn slippers, a symbol of the wildness tempered by love and the deep, silent healing that had transformed a reclusive artist's life, painting a new, vibrant landscape onto her soul. The story of Eleanor, Orion, and Marmalade became a quiet legend in Snowpine Creek and eventually beyond. Visitors to Martha's gallery would often inquire, fascinated by the tale. Eleanor's paintings, now vibrant with newfound joy and hope, featuring subtle nods to her unusual muse, began to sell out as soon as they were displayed. Ranger Albright, though maintaining his professional distance during his scheduled inspections, would occasionally leave a package of specialized bear enrichment toys or a bag of high-quality fish at Eleanor's gate, a silent acknowledgement of their successful, albeit extraordinary, coexistence. He had even started carrying a small, worn copy of a book on bear behavior, finding himself increasingly fascinated by Orion's unique adaptations. The most profound moments, however, remained private, Eleanor painting by the window, Orion watching her every brushstroke, his intelligent eyes following the movement of her hand, the soft purr of Marmalade intermingling with the low, contented huff, a sound more dog-like than bear-like, a legacy of his upbringing, of the bear as they shared the quiet moments of the day. Their unusual family, forged by a harsh winter and sustained by stubborn love, thrived in the heart of the wilderness, a living masterpiece of connection that proved some bonds transcended every boundary, even those between species. Eleanor had not just saved a bear, the bear had, in turn, saved her, pulling her from the depths of her grief and guiding her back to the vibrant colors of life. Her canvas was no longer just a reflection of the outside world, but a testament to the extraordinary world she had built within her own home. And in the quiet evenings, as the stars began to prick the inky sky above the Cascade Mountains, Eleanor, Orion, and Marmalade would sit together on the porch, a silent symphony of interconnected lives, a testament to love found in the most unexpected places.